Mara Voss had not spoken her full name in 4 years. She had not needed to. In the Royal Kingswood Library, tucked behind the east wing of the palace, no one asked, no one came. No one cared enough to wonder who organized the old maps, or who kept the dust from settling too thickly on the leather spines that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She was simply the girl in the library, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She had arrived at the palace on a cold November morning, carrying a single bag and a letter of recommendation written by a professor who had long since forgotten her name. The position was small, assistant archivist, 3rd grade, which meant she was responsible for tasks no one else wanted: recataloguing old territorial documents, repairing torn pages with fine paper tape, organizing donation collections that arrived in cardboard boxes smelling of attics and old rain. The pay was barely enough. The room she was given, tucked behind shelf row 7 where the military history section ended and the geographic surveys began, was smaller than a storage cupboard. But it had a lock, and it was inside the palace walls, and no one, she had quickly learned, paid attention to archivists. That was the most important thing. Before the library, there had been a life that felt like something breaking slowly. Her father, a decent man with a weakness for trusting the wrong people, had signed his name on documents he didn't fully understand. The men who gave him those documents were not decent at all. When everything collapsed, the house, the accounts, the quiet respectability her family had kept for 2 generations, the men came looking, not for her father, who had already gone to stay with a cousin far in the north. They came looking for Mara, because she was easier to find. And because pressure applied to a daughter, they believed, was pressure applied everywhere. She had left the city on a Tuesday. She had not told anyone. She had taken a train, then a bus, then walked 3 miles to the palace gates with the letter in her coat pocket. And when the old archivist, Henrik, had looked over her application with tired eyes and said, "You'll do," she had felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in months. That had been 4 years ago. Now she knew every corner of the library, the way some people knew their own homes. She knew which floorboards creaked near the entrance, and which ones near the reading table were silent. She knew that the heating pipes on the north wall made a low ticking sound at 7 in the evening, and that the light through the high western window turned a particular shade of amber at 4 in the afternoon that made even the dullest documents look beautiful. She knew that mice came in through a gap behind the geography section, and that if she left small pieces of bread near the gap, they tended not to chew through the older manuscripts. She had named the mice Gerald and Pip. Henrik had let her be. He was a gentle, largely silent man in his 70s, who left task lists on her desk each morning, written in a handwriting so small she needed to hold the paper close to read it. He never asked where she was from. He never asked about her family. He arrived at 8, drank 2 cups of tea at his desk, and was gone by 3. He had seemed, in the beginning, like a temporary arrangement, someone who might eventually begin asking questions, but the questions never came. He seemed to understand, in the way that old people sometimes do, that some people need a quiet place more than they need conversation. Then, one Monday in early March, there was no task list. There was a note instead, slipped under the archive door. Henrik has retired with immediate effect due to health concerns. Administrative oversight of the Royal Library will be reassigned. Please maintain current duties until further notice. Mara read the note 3 times. Then she sat on the floor between shelf row 7 and shelf row 8, with her back against the spines of a collection of 19th century land surveys, and thought carefully about what this meant. It meant someone new would come, someone with questions. She gave herself 1 week to figure out what to do. In the meantime, she worked. She always worked when she was anxious. It gave her hands something to do, and quieted the thinking that otherwise went in circles. She climbed the rolling ladder along shelf row 14 and began the recataloguing project she had been planning for months, a full reorganization of the old territorial maps, stored in long flat cases on the upper shelves, many of which had been misfiled so long ago that no one remembered where they were supposed to go. It was careful, slow work. She liked it. She was on the ladder the evening that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that clearly afterward. The particular quietness of a Tuesday evening in the palace, when most of the administrative staff had gone home and the corridors outside the library sat empty and echo-soft. She was on the upper rungs of the ladder, a map case balanced across her forearms, checking the reference number on the case against the number penciled on the shelf when she heard the library door open. She did not come down. She had learned, in 4 years, that if she stayed still and quiet, almost everyone who opened the library door did so by accident, looking for a meeting room, or a bathroom, or simply following a wrong turn, and left within 2 minutes. She pressed herself gently closer to the shelf and waited. The footsteps that came through the door were not uncertain. They were slow and deliberate, the footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had simply decided this was where they wanted to be. She heard the chair at the long reading table shift, then silence. Mara waited. The silence continued. She waited longer. The person at the table did not leave. They did not open a book. They did not shuffle papers or check a phone or do any of the things that restless people do when they sit in a room. They simply sat, and after 10 minutes of this, Mara realized, with a kind of slow dread, that she was sharing the library with someone who was also looking for silence. 40 minutes passed. She did not move. Her arms had begun to ache from holding the map case, but she was afraid that setting it down would make noise, and noise would require explanation, and explanation would require her to say things she had spent 4 years carefully not saying. Then the ladder wheel shifted. It was nothing dramatic. A small movement, the kind that happens when weight redistributes itself on old equipment, but the ladder rolled perhaps 4 inches along its track, and the map case in Mara's arms tilted, and she grabbed for the shelf with one hand and managed to hold on, but the map case slipped and fell in a long, flat arc, and struck the edge of the reading table with a sound that filled the entire library. She looked down. He looked up. She had seen the Alpha King before, the way anyone who lived inside the palace had seen him, at a distance, moving through corridors with advisors close behind, a tall and serious figure, who occupied space in a way that made other people unconsciously step aside. But she had never been 6 feet above him on a ladder, and he had never looked directly at her, and the experience of both of these things happening at the same time was profoundly disorienting. Alpha King Dorian Ashvale was 34. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away easily, sharp along the jaw, steady in the eyes, the face of someone who had learned long ago that showing what he was thinking was a form of giving something up. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not angry, not alarmed, simply still, in the way he had been still since he sat down. He said, very calmly, "How long have you been up there?" "I work here," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked around the library slowly, as if seeing it more carefully. Then he looked back at her. "I've never seen you before." "That was the point," she said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but something. He didn't ask her to come down. He didn't call for anyone. He looked at her for a moment longer, then looked away, and said nothing else. After a while, Mara carefully descended the ladder. She picked up the map case from the floor, checked it for damage, and carried it to the cataloging desk without looking at him. Her hands were steady. She was very proud of her hands. He left 20 minutes later. He didn't say goodbye, but at the door, he paused and said without turning around, "You've organized this place well." Then he was gone. She stood very still for a long time after the door closed. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He never announced himself. He arrived in the evenings, sat at the reading table, sometimes read and sometimes didn't, and left after an hour or so. He never brought advisors. He never brought paperwork. He came, Mara slowly understood, for the same reason she lived here, because the library was quiet, and the world outside it was not. They did not talk much, but they talked a little. She learned that he disliked meetings that ran past 7 in the evening. He learned that she had reorganized the entire map collection by hand over 18 months. She told him about Gerald and Pip. He looked at her for a moment, and then said, entirely seriously, "Are they well behaved?" Which made her laugh for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. She did not let herself think too carefully about what was happening, because thinking carefully about it would have required her to admit that something was happening, and she was not ready for that. Then the audit notice arrived. It came in a pale envelope addressed to all palace staff, requesting updated identity and lineage documentation for administrative records. It was routine, the letter said. It was thorough. It required full legal names, family records, and current status documentation submitted within 30 days. Mara held the letter for a very long time. She had been careful. Her palace records listed her as M. Voss, assistant archivist. Nobody had ever checked the first initial. Nobody had ever pulled her original application. But an audit was different. An audit pulled everything. She had almost decided to leave, to simply pack her bag from behind shelf row 7 and disappear again, the way she had disappeared before, when the library door opened on a Thursday evening and Dorian sat down at the reading table and placed a file on the surface between them. It was thin and pale and had her father's name on the cover. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "You can tell me yourself," he said, "or I can read it. I would rather hear it from you." She sat down across from him, the first time she had ever sat at the reading table, and she looked at the file, and then at her own hands, and she took a slow breath, and she told him. She told him about her father, and the documents he hadn't understood, and the men who had come afterward. She told him about the Tuesday she left, the train, and the bus, and the 3 miles on foot. She told him about Henrik, and his small handwriting, and his 2 cups of morning tea. She told him about 4 years of silence, and seasons seen through a high window, and learning to be invisible so completely that she had sometimes, alone in the evenings, wondered if she had disappeared even from herself. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, but her voice went quiet in certain places, and he let it be quiet, and did not try to fill the silence with anything. When she finished, he was still for a moment. Then he said, "The debt claim, I've seen it before. There were several like it, from the same group of men. The claims were fraudulent. Your father signed documents he was deliberately misled about." He paused. "A legal review 2 years ago flagged the entire practice. The creditors involved lost their operating licenses. The debts were declared void." Mara looked at him. "The claim against your family," he said, "was not legally valid. It hasn't been for 2 years." She sat with this information for a long time. It moved through her slowly, the way cold water moves when you've been holding it, and it gradually takes the temperature of your hands. 2 years. She had been hiding for 2 years after there was nothing left to hide from. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He didn't seem to expect her to. What happened after that was not dramatic. There were no sudden declarations or moments designed to be remembered. Life simply shifted, the way it does when a long tension is finally released. Not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of something settling into a better shape. The audit was completed. Her records were updated with her full name and full history, submitted without consequence. The back room behind shelf row 7 remained hers. She was formally appointed head archivist, a position that came with a small increase in pay, a larger desk, and, for the first time, a nameplate on the door. M. Voss, head archivist. She kept the M. She had grown fond of small mysteries. Dorian continued to come on Thursday evenings, and sometimes on Tuesdays, and once on a Wednesday when the advisors had been particularly difficult, and the library was the only place in the palace that felt, as he put it simply, like itself. She understood what he meant. On the first evening of April, she left the library door propped open, just slightly, just enough that the warmth from the corridor could come in, and the sound of the palace in the evening, distant and ordinary and alive, could drift through. She stood at the threshold for a moment, looking out rather than in. Behind her, Gerald appeared from behind the geography section and regarded her with small, unimpressed eyes. "I know," she told him. "It's a big change." She left the door open anyway. Some things, she had learned, were worth being found.